So in this long-awaited debate, we'll be making an extremely important decision for our island. We'll be deciding whether to proceed to legislate for assisted dying or overturn the previous Assembly's in-principle decision to permit assisted dying. I'm sure members will agree that the complexity and sensitive nature of the proposals deserve a clear and comprehensive introduction, and as a consequence, I feel obliged to inform the Assembly that this introductory speech will take quite some time in its delivery. So I hope members will bear with me as I seek to do justice to what I know we all consider to be an extremely compelling issue. So the proposals presented today are the result of over 2 years' work. They set out the blueprint for an assisted dying service that's workable, well-regulated, will minimise risk, and provide excellent safeguards. They're more comprehensive than any other assisted dying proposal in the British Isles to date, and that's because in November 2021, the Assembly decided that fully detailed proposals should be brought back for consideration. So I became Minister for Health and Social Services 4 months ago, at which point the proposals before us now were already drafted and being subjected to final review. So my role has to date been limited to examining and endorsing, something I'm very pleased to do given my personal views on the subject. I'll comment briefly on those a little bit later, sir. In the meantime, I want to recognise my predecessors for their hard work in overseeing an extensive process of decision-making, public consultation and engagement with key stakeholders. I know they may have held differing personal views on assisted dying, but despite any personal conflict they may have felt, they oversaw an open and robust process of examination in the interests of our community. That's to their credit, and I'd like to offer them my personal thanks. So these proposals set out what some might consider to be an unnecessary or potentially terrifying step into the unknown. But the reality is that hundreds of millions of people across almost 30 jurisdictions already have access to some form of similar service. The opponents of assisted dying and much of the media coverage naturally gravitates towards the flaws in other jurisdictions' legislation that can allow for things to go wrong. We hear of Canada and their slippery slope, of ever-expanding eligibility criteria, of a perceived duty to die felt by some disabled people, of teenagers with anorexia ending their lives, and of road accident victims having an assisted death within days of learning that they have life-changing injuries. What we don't hear so much about is the peaceful assisted deaths taking place in Oregon and other US states, New Zealand and Australia, about people who are suffering and in pain being afforded dignity and the support and care they want to safely and compassionately take control of the end of their lives. Jersey is not at the forefront of assisted dying, and today is not important because we're making the news, but because we're taking the opportunity to consider how best to provide islanders with choice at the most difficult time in their lives. When the previous Assembly made the in-principle decision, we were the first jurisdiction in the British Isles to do so, but much has changed over the past 2.5 years, and other jurisdictions are now moving at a pace. Scotland and the Isle of Man are listening to their public and considering how best to give them choice. Further afield, assisted dying laws have now come into effect in Spain, Austria, and all the Australian states. Most of us want to see a change in the law. Opinion polls and deliberative democratic processes, such as our own citizens' jury, consistently demonstrate that the majority of the public here, across the British Islands and beyond, believe the introduction of assisted dying is the right thing to do. And the momentum for change has never been stronger. That said, some of us in the Assembly do not support assisted dying, and that's also the case across the island. But it's a simple fact that the majority of Jersey people do, along with the majority across the UK. As representatives of the public, we should not be asking if, but how. How do we provide an assisted dying service that meets the needs of people and that works to minimise risk? The proposals before us today describe the how. They're the culmination of 2 phases of public stakeholder consultation that include public meetings attended by islanders who expressed hopes and concerns relating to assisted dying. The process included in-depth research about assisted dying in other jurisdictions and conversations with both assisted dying practitioners, regulators and opponents in jurisdictions that permit assisted dying. The consultation and development phase included extensive dialogue with health and care practitioners. There were 10 public meetings, many of which were attended by on-island health and care professionals during 2 phases of consultation. That included 4 dedicated sessions for healthcare staff, as well as ongoing dialogue with professional leads groups that included a list of top-level medical professionals, far too numerous to recount. In addition, the team has worked with the UK professional regulatory bodies to ensure these proposals will accord with their standards and requirements for health and care professionals. This includes the General Medical Council, the Nursing and Midwifery Council, the General Pharmaceutical Council, and the Health and Care Professions Council, who provided valuable feedback. So in these discussions, we've moved beyond earlier concerns that these bodies would prevent their professionals from carrying out assisted dying. We're working with them on the how, not the if. The GMC and other bodies have not indicated in any way that the current proposals would be unworkable for their registered professionals. Professional feedback has directly shaped all of these proposals. This includes, amongst many other matters, provisions relating to the following: the establishment of a multidisciplinary team, the development of a specific assisted dying capacity test, the requirement for an administrating practitioner to work alongside another member of the assisted dying service, the requirement to provide welfare support for all health and care professionals caring for a person, not just those involved in the assisted death, the chain of control for the assisted dying substance, the requirement to protect any healthcare professionals who opt to work for assisted dying, in assisted dying from discrimination, and equally importantly, those who decline to do so. Notwithstanding all of this detailed engagement, when I attended a departmental briefing 2 weeks ago, I heard anger expressed by some staff who are opposed to assisted dying, who feel they've had no opportunity to be heard. This, sir, is not the case. They've had every opportunity to be heard, and they have been heard. It's a matter of public record that we've committed to undertake further survey work with health and care workforce after the Assembly has determined whether to proceed to develop an assisted dying law, and when we better understand the role of health and care professionals in relation to Route 1 and Route 2 should either be adopted. This accords with the recommendations of the ethical review authors who acknowledge the work already undertaken to engage health and care professionals, but also suggest a post-debate follow-up. The feedback from that survey would then be presented to the Assembly alongside the draft law. We know that doctors, nurses and other professionals hold a range of views on assisted dying, much like the wider public and members of this Assembly. But whether we support assisted dying or not, we must recognise the fact that we are here today because islanders have demanded we address the issue. In 2018, there was a public petition demanding we do just that. In response, a previous Minister of Health and Social Services established a citizens' jury so that we, as an Assembly, knew what islanders thought. He recognised the need to listen to the public, despite his own personal opposition to assisted dying. And I thank him, sir, for putting islanders first. Opponents to assisted dying criticised the jury process for including 19 islanders who, at the outset, supported assisted dying in some degree, and 4 islanders who did not. Those proportions reflected the consistent levels of support for assisted dying in the British Isles. We were then told that the public support comes from a place of ignorance, of not knowing what assisted dying is or what it means. So even if we assume that to be true, members of our citizens' jury most certainly did understand the meaning of assisted dying by the end of a 9-week process. And they still voted overwhelmingly in favour of permitting it in Jersey. So citizens have been at the heart of the decision-making process about what will happen in future. However, it's important to acknowledge that in the present, some islanders make arrangements to travel to Switzerland for an assisted death. Those islanders are not afforded the same protections or support that domestic law could provide if we choose to legislate. In 1997, we grasped the nettle and legislated for termination of pregnancy, rather than continue to push women to the UK like a dirty secret to be swept under the carpet. And now we need to do the same, sir, for assisted dying. I'll provide an overview of the key provisions of the proposed assisted dying shortly, but before doing so, I want to touch on the structure of this proposition, which has been constructed to allow the Assembly to vote separately on 5 key paragraphs. In summary, paragraph A provides a mandate to progress to law drafting and sets out the core eligibility criteria. It's taken alongside an appendix which sets out essential provisions and safeguards and the associated arrangements for regulation and oversight. Paragraph B is a vote for assisted dying for those with a terminal illness, referred to as Route 1. Paragraph C is a vote for assisted dying for those with unbearable suffering who may or may not have a terminal illness, referred to as Route 2. Paragraph D, as amended, provides the right for any person to refuse to participate in assisted death, and Part E sets out the requirement for minimum timeframes in the process. The terms Route 1 and Route 2 refer to the different approval routes for an assisted dying request. Under Route 1, two doctors must, independently of each other, confirm a person's eligibility for an assisted death before that person's request could be approved. Under Route 2, a tribunal, which would be established by the court service, must examine and confirm or reject that approval. It is known that some members of this Assembly and the public are concerned about the inclusion of Route 2. It's important to note that the previous Minister for Health and Social Services, in consultation with the previous Minister for Justice and Home Affairs and the Minister for the Environment, determined that Route 2 should nonetheless be included in the proposals in order to accord with the in-principle decision taken by the Assembly in 2021, but that it must be considered separately from Route 1. Some members of the current Council do not support assisted dying, others support Route 1 only, and some, like me, support both Routes 1 and 2. But collectively, this Council, like a number of previous ministers, also agreed that Route 2 should be included in the proposition because it is for members here today to determine how to proceed. So, as members will know, the lodging period for this proposition was extended to 9 weeks, and of course it had to be reviewed by the Assisted Dying Scrutiny Panel. Given the subject matter, this was nonetheless a pressurised timeframe in which to review such details and lengthy proposals. Accordingly, I'd like to thank the panel for their work and applaud them for completing it, what can best be described as a Herculean task in such a short space of time. That said, sir, I remain puzzled as to why they question the rationale for inclusion of Route 2 based solely on concerns expressed by the authors of the ethical review. I would remind members that the review consisted of 3 ethicists, none of whom rejected the principle of assisted dying outright, but all 3 had known reservations about ethical limits of practice. The reason for the inclusion of Route 2 is very simple. It's to uphold the integrity of our democratic process. It's what the previous Assembly voted for in 2021, and it's precisely what's been delivered, albeit with appropriate variations and refinements, which I will also address. So, in the proposition, paragraph A sets out who may be eligible for an assisted death. The law will be clear. Only adults aged 18 and over who've been ordinary resident in Jersey for at least 12 months, who have capacity, and whose wish for an assisted death is voluntary, clear, settled, and informed. In this instance, voluntary means an absence of coercion or pressure by any other person. Clear and settled means that the person's decision is fixed, well considered, and not rushed.
Sorry, Minister, whose device was that? That mustn't happen again, do you understand? Yes.
So, informed means that the person knows about and understands the assisted dying process, and more importantly, is fully informed on all other care and treatment options that are available to them. If adopted, the law will set out a specific capacity test related to an assisted dying decision, and mandatory training will ensure assisted dying professionals are robustly equipped to navigate this important safeguard. The presumption of capacity is a guiding principle of capacity legislation, but the proposals are clear. An assessing doctor must be satisfied that there is no evidence that a person lacks capacity in order to assess them as eligible. Where there is any doubt, this will also involve seeking an additional opinion from a psychiatrist or other specialist. Assisted dying is a choice that only a small number of islanders will make, but it's not and never will be the majority. Using data from other jurisdictions, we can estimate that at most around 38 islanders may have an assisted death, and likely far fewer, possibly as few as 6. This is an option for a minority of islanders who, for good reason, believe it to be the right choice for them. Paragraph B, Route 1, provides for assisted dying for those with a terminal physical condition and limited life expectancy. That condition must be giving rise, or expected to give rise to, unbearable suffering, which cannot be alleviated in a manner the person finds tolerable. Assisted dying will only be permitted for people with a physical medical condition, and this applies to both Routes 1 and 2. It will not be permitted for people with a mental illness alone. This doesn't mean that someone with cancer, for example, cannot have an assisted death if they also have depression, but they must have a physical health condition, and any mental health condition that they may have cannot interfere with their capacity to make an assisted dying decision. This applies to both Routes 1 and 2. Under Route 1, the condition must be given rise to unbearable suffering in the here and now, or there must be an expectation of unbearable suffering that is related to the medical condition. A person diagnosed with an aggressive terminal cancer, which is associated with pain, will not be required to wait until they're suffering extreme pain to have an assisted death, or so loaded with pain control that they're unable to engage with their loved ones. Similarly, a person with a terminal neurodegenerative condition will not have to wait until they're suffering from an inability to speak, swallow, or move before they have an assisted death. Route 1 was found to be ethically appropriate by the ethical review authors, who stated it strikes an appropriate balance between empowering and protecting people. It's intended to provide for people who are suffering or expected to suffer and want to control the end of their life. We all know of good deaths, and we all hope that we and our loved ones will have good deaths. But the reality is that even with the best care and treatment in the world, not all deaths are good. All too often there is pain, or the terrible numbing effects of pain medication, suffering and fear in the weeks leading up to death. There is also a loss of dignity and control, which many people find unbearable, humiliating or terrifying, and nothing can alleviate that but the release afforded by death. To be eligible for an assisted death, it's proposed that the person must have a reasonably anticipated life expectancy of 6 months or 12 months in the case of neurodegenerative conditions, such as motor neurone or Parkinson's disease. The 12-month provision goes beyond the Assembly's initial in-principle agreement, recognising that neurodegenerative conditions are likely to result in significant deterioration in quality of life and unbearable suffering before the person reaches 6 months of life expectancy. For a person with motor neurone disease, the final 12 months is often a period of rapid loss of bodily functions, impacting the person's ability to move, speak, eat, drink, and eventually to breathe. The proposals acknowledge the limitations associated with the accurate predictions around life expectancy, be that 6 or 12 months. We all know of someone who has long outlived the odds. These are the stories, sir, that we hear about, but in reality, they're exceptions to the rule. Studies show that doctors are statistically more likely to overestimate life expectancy in patients with advanced incurable cancer, not underestimate. Reasonable predictions of life expectancy are made every day in our hospital and in healthcare services the world over. The introduction of an assisted dying law doesn't change that. We must also recognise that life expectancy is never the sole factor in a person's decision to have an assisted death. People don't simply say, I've only got 6 months, so I'll just go now. They weigh up their suffering, their pain, fear, loss of control and dignity, not just a predicted time frame. The proposed 6-month or 12-month life expectancy reflects the eligibility criteria in a number of countries where assisted dying is already lawful, including New Zealand, Australia and Oregon. It's also a feature of the current Isle of Man proposals. Some other countries take a different approach. For example, in Canada, the requirement is for a natural death that is reasonably foreseeable, and the Scottish proposals only require a diagnosis of terminal illness with no associated life expectancy. The ethical review noted the inclusion of timeframes as more objective and measurable, making the law more clearly defined and easier to apply. Paragraph C provides for Route 2 assisted dying for those with an incurable physical medical condition that's currently giving rise to unbearable suffering that cannot be alleviated in a manner that the person deems to be tolerable. For example, a person who suffered a catastrophic stroke or life-changing injuries from a motoring accident. Route 2 may also include a person who has a terminal illness that is causing them suffering in the here and now, but whose life expectancy is more than 6 or 12 months. We know there are concerns around Route 2, even amongst people who support assisted dying. Those concerns predominantly focus on three matters: the principle of assisting people to die when they're not terminally ill, the subjectiveness of assessing suffering, and fears that we may impose on disabled people a sense that they have a duty to die because they are a burden or their lives are of limited value. So some argue that Route 2 goes beyond assisted dying as a means to provide control over the manner and timing of an imminent death, that it changes the trajectory of life and as such should not be permitted. Others argue the opposite, that Route 2 must be permitted if we're to be a compassionate society that provides people with choice when they're experiencing unbearable suffering with no prospect of being released from it. The proposals acknowledge that suffering is both subjective and multifaceted, that it can include mental, emotional, social and spiritual suffering, as well as physical pain, and that it cannot be assessed objectively by a third party. Nevertheless, it can be subject to a thorough assessment process. If accepted, the law will be clear. Both of the assessing doctors must determine that the suffering is a result of a physical medical condition. If a person is suffering solely as a result of external factors, such as their living situation or anxiety, for example, they will not be found eligible. The assessing doctors must make a referral to a professional with the relevant skills, such as a psychiatrist or psychologist, if there is any doubt as to the reasons for a person's suffering. The assessing doctors cannot determine whether a person can bear their suffering, but they can determine whether they're satisfied that the person concerned deems their suffering to be unbearable. Assisted dying on the basis of unbearable suffering, as opposed to just terminal illness, has featured in legislation in the Netherlands and Belgium for over 20 years. It's a well-trodden route, and our laws and guidance would work to ensure that the experiences of Canada cannot be replicated on our shores. We know that the ethical review team expressed serious reservations about Route 2, including concerns about it perpetuating ableist judgments on the value of the lives of disabled persons, a societal assumption that their lives are somehow less worth living. However, and as set out in the addendum to this proposition, against that we have to set the findings of officers who recently undertook additional targeted engagement with disabled islanders and those with long-term health conditions in order to better understand their views on Route 2. This was in addition to previous consultation on the wider proposals. So amongst the self-selecting group that participated, views on assisted dying were mixed, but around half the participants supported Route 2. Some stated that Route 2 shouldn't be rejected on the grounds of supposedly protecting disabled islanders, and that to do so was patronising and paternalistic. Others said that the introduction of Route 2 would have little impact, as society already judges the lives of disabled people. Of course, those views were not held by all, with others expressing their concerns about the potential negative effects on the lives of disabled people. So the proposals provide for an assessment process that has been shaped by learning from assisted dying practitioners in other jurisdictions and by listening to UK regulatory bodies and healthcare practitioners here in Jersey. The process itself consists of 8 steps, from the first formal request for an assisted death through to the assessment, approval, planning and provision of the assisted death. The person moves through the process at their own pace with the ability to pause or withdraw at any time. This isn't something that happens to them, they are in control of the process. For some, this sense of choice and control has in itself a palliative effect. Other jurisdictions report that a significant proportion of the people whose request for an assisted death is approved do not go on to have an assisted death. Last year in Oregon and in some other Australian states, over 30% of the people prescribed an assisted drug substance didn't actually take it. Having the ability to end their suffering allows every qualifying person to judge for themselves how much pain they are able and prepared to tolerate. In some cases, that pain never gets to the point of intolerability. Circumstances permitting, they can, and sometimes do, still die without assistance. Paragraph E of the proposition provides for a minimum time frame. This is the fastest pace at which a person could move through the process. It allows a period of time for reflection to ensure that a person's wish for an assisted death is settled and clear. For those with terminal illnesses, That's 14 days, a balance between allowing doctors to be confident that the person's request for an assisted death is enduring, whilst not unduly extending any suffering and uncertainty for that person. That minimum time frame is extended to 90 days for those eligible under Route 2, where the person's end of life is not imminent. A decision to end their life through an assisted dying is altering the trajectory of their life in a way that's different to those who are terminally ill. This additional time allows for detailed exploration of all other possibilities for the person in terms of treatment, pain relief, and other care options. In relation to Route 1, if the person is at the very end of life with a life expectancy of less than 2 weeks, there will be no minimum time frame. However, that person must still undergo the full assessment and approval process and meet all the eligibility requirements set out in law. A person may only be assessed as eligible if two assessing doctors are entirely satisfied that they meet all the eligibility criteria. The assessment is not a one-off appointment, sir. It's a process. The assessing doctor must understand and document the person's motivations, ensure they understand what's involved, and that they've had every opportunity to consider or try alternative care and treatment, both under Route 1 and Route 2. The assessing doctors will be supported by a multidisciplinary team to provide checks and challenges, additional perspectives, and expertise. In addition, the assessing doctors will be required by law to seek additional opinion or assessments from those with relevant skill and experience to inform their decision-making, be that opinion on prognosis and end-of-life expectancy from an oncologist or determination of capacity by a psychiatrist if the person also has a mental health diagnosis. For those eligible under Route 2, there's an additional step in the process. The approval by 2 doctors must be confirmed by a tribunal, an important additional safeguard protecting those who may be suffering unbearably but are not at the natural end of their life. This is yet another safeguard to ensure that only those truly eligible are approved for an assisted death. The law would also provide for appeals to the Royal Court for both Route 1 and Route 2. Other jurisdictions don't permit such appeals, but they're proposed in Jersey to support public confidence, a position that is supported by the Ethical Review. Appeals are a further safeguard helping ensure that people who are not eligible for assisted dying are not given access, and equally helping ensure that those who do meet the legal criteria are not denied the choice. A recent letter to the JEP expressed concern that the reader had not seen any safeguards in our proposals that would prevent a person being coerced into asking for an assisted death. And actually, sir, they're quite right. We can't stop human nature. And we can't stop a vulnerable person being coerced into asking for an assisted death. However, sir, we can stop a vulnerable person from being approved for an assisted death. These proposals have safeguards hardwired throughout. They work to ensure that the dysfunctional relationships that sometimes exist in our society do not translate into a situation where people are coerced into having assisted deaths when they shouldn't. Assisted dying professionals will be trained and will have the skills to identify potential coercion. They'll be looking for it actively. Assessing doctors will be supported in this task by a multidisciplinary team consisting of nurses, social workers, speech and language therapists, and others with experience and knowledge to complement the doctor's skill set. So, some have expressed concern about approving proposals without knowing the exact drugs and dosages that will be used to bring about an assisted death. This is as it should be, and it's for good reason. It's only right that information about medications that bring about death should not be in the public domain. But further to this, we haven't yet decided upon the drugs that would be used. There are constant developments in the availability and efficacy of drugs, hence there would be little sense in making a clinical decision today about substances that would not be used until the law might come into effect 3 years hence. The proposals provide that the Assurance and Delivery Committee would determine the substance closer to the time of the law coming into force, if indeed it does. And these decisions would be subject to consultation with the relevant pharmaceutical bodies. But what we already know is that the substances used will, most likely, be drugs that are regularly used today. It's the combination of drugs and dosages which may be different. We also know that comparison cannot be drawn between assisted dying and the execution of prisoners on death row. There is a very significant difference between ending the life of someone who is very ill and a strong, physically healthy person in detention. So stories abound about terrible complications when executing prisoners, but we know from published evidence from Australia that complications have only been experienced in less than 3% of assisted deaths. And in all of those cases, the complications related to the time taken to die or difficulties with oral ingestion, such as vomiting. They did not lead to a difficult or stressful end of life. In any event, our proposals guard against any remote possibility. 2 members of the assisted dying service will remain with the person as they die to ensure all goes well. One of those is the administrating practitioner, who will have available all the medical equipment and resources needed to intervene in the highly unlikely event of any difficulties, including the vomiting of substances. And the safeguards baked into the proposals continue beyond the person's death. Each assisted death will be subjected to review by an independent review panel, ensuring adherence to guidance and the law, and identifying any areas in the process that require improvements. So it's not uncommon to find that talk of assisted dying leads to further discussion about palliative and end-of-life care. So it's important to be mindful of the fact that assisted dying is not a replacement for existing care and treatment options. We know that over 85% of people requesting assisted dying in other jurisdictions are also receiving palliative or end-of-life care at the same time as their request. The UK Select Committee inquiry into assisted dying looked closely at the matter and concluded that there was no evidence of palliative and end-of-life care deteriorating in quality or provision in countries that have introduced assisted dying. Indeed, they noted that in many jurisdictions, the services and funding had improved. The introduction of assisted dying rightly places a spotlight on all end-of-life services. Here, we propose exactly the same. A request for assisted dying must not be a compromise. It must not be a false choice, taken only because the alternatives are not adequate. We already have a great hospice service, but we need to be confident we're providing excellent end-of-life and palliative care across the board. In Jersey's case, the end-of-life strategy, published last November, alongside the additional £2 to £3 million the Assembly committed, has already driven improvements. The baseline data needed to track improvements is being confirmed in the coming weeks, and from that point onwards, we'll have a foundation for measuring success. Returning to scrutiny, I've accepted the key recommendation from their review panel to evidence the quality and availability of palliative and end-of-life care in Jersey at least 2 months before the assisted dying legislation would be debated by this Assembly. And, as stated, I'm confident that improvements are already being made. Furthermore, officers are working on the development of an adult safeguarding law, which, it is envisaged, will place a statutory duty on the Minister of Health to provide palliative care in Jersey. So, during the development of these proposals, we've also given detailed consideration to the impact of assisted dying on health and care professionals. Paragraph D, as amended, provides that no person should be under a legal duty to participate in the provision of assisted dying. This non-participation clause is much wider than that provided under the current termination of pregnancy, as non-participation can be on any grounds, for example, emotional or practical grounds, not just grounds of conscience. Clearly, however, whilst any professional may choose not to participate, they must act in accordance with their UK professional registration body's existing conscientious objection guidance. That means they cannot refuse to provide normal or ongoing care to a person. They can't humiliate or criticise them, and they mustn't prevent them from accessing information about assisted dying. Health and care professionals must opt in voluntarily to work for the assisted dying service. They must meet all the competency criteria and must undergo assisted dying training. We know from those with experience in delivering an assisted dying service that supporting people at the end of life can be extremely rewarding, but also emotionally challenging. So we've accounted for the provision of peer and psychological support for assisted dying professionals and for other professionals who are caring for a person who requests an assisted death, even where they're not directly engaged in the process. This is in addition to the therapeutic support for the person making the request and counselling and bereavement support for their loved ones, both during the assessment process and post-death. There have been detailed discussions with the UK regulatory bodies about the competency criteria, including the length of time a doctor or nurse has been qualified. The UK bodies suggested that a doctor or nurse who has undertaken the appropriate training and meets all the other competency criteria could work in the service 12 months after qualifying as a nurse or doctor. So unfortunately, this has been challenged in recent weeks by on-island healthcare professionals, and during the law drafting process, we would work with them to review that proposal. We would also work with professionals when developing the detailed forms, guidance and the training package that would underpin the law and collectively support all professionals to operate in accordance with that law. So I'd like to end by addressing some of the concerns that have been raised by those opposed to assisted dying. First, the matter of this proposition being the start of a slippery slope. Here I would simply ask how, then why, that would happen. During the consultation process, much has been said about the apparent runaway assisted dying training in Canada. But we are not Canada. We do not have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that provides us a right to die. There is no equivalent under the European Convention on Human Rights, and challenges to the European Court on matters related to assisted dying have not resulted in an expansion of eligibility criteria in European jurisdictions where assisted dying is permitted. The European Court, which has jurisdiction over countries that both permit and do not permit assisted dying, provides for a wide margin of appreciation in such matters of a moral and ethical nature. In layman's terms, it allows jurisdictions to self-determine matters related to assisted dying, providing they accord with convention rights, which our proposals do. Canada is a false comparison. In Canada, the Supreme Court can effectively require their Parliament to bring forward legislation on the basis of their ruling. That is not the case here. The States Assembly has parliamentary sovereignty and is the supreme authority where we can create or amend any law subject to royal assent. It cannot be compelled to do so by the courts. Any decision to change this law will be that of the Assembly alone. Furthermore, the proposals clearly state that the proposed law will not allow any regulation or order-making powers, and I think that's a point that members should take into account. So, any further changes to the Jersey assisted dying law would require precisely the same degree of care and attention that this process has received. So this is an extremely important point. Some opponents of assisted dying have said there are no safeguards in the proposals, and this is manifestly incorrect. Every element of these proposals is a safeguard. They are thorough. Some have challenged this as bureaucracy, but the numerous requirements are there to provide the crucial balance between affording people the right to choose and protecting them from harm. And for some opponents of this proposition, there will never be enough to satisfy their concerns. The proposals set out the safeguards to ensure only those who meet the eligibility criteria set out in the law can have an assisted death. They set out safeguards to protect and support islanders throughout the assisted dying process. But importantly, also safeguards to ensure health and care professionals are supported and protected. What's more, the Jersey Assisted Dying Service would have robust oversight. It would be well regulated, with good governance being hardwired in from the start. The core function of the Delivery and Assurance Committee is to ensure safety and good service. They would publish an annual report to provide transparency about assisted dying in Jersey, and each and every death would be reviewed by an independent panel. In addition, reporting on death certificates would be recorded in the same way as any other deaths in Jersey. That is to say, openly and transparently, acknowledging both the assisted death and the health condition that made the person eligible. The ethical review noted there are strong arguments for the clear, consistent and accurate reporting requirements set out in these proposals. As a further provision, the Jersey Care Commission will register and inspect the service with the powers to sanction and, if necessary, the power to deregister the service, effectively shutting it down. This is not a service where a Harold Shippen or Lucy Lepley could hide in plain sight, sir. Any professional with malintent would quickly be identified and exposed by the thorough oversight process. If someone of bad intent really wanted to inherit early, the very last place to start would be Jersey's Assisted Dying Service. And what about the why question? Well, as a small and close island community, why on earth would the majority of us decide to take action that would not be in our best interests? If that were to happen, I'd venture to suggest that a lot else would be going wrong. To the best of my knowledge, we don't have a history of that sort of behaviour in Jersey, sir. Finally, to costs. Indicative estimates are just over £1 million to set up the service, including the necessary oversight arrangements, and potentially up to 1.4 million in annual running costs. These costs are indicative at this stage and will vary depending on the numbers of people who request an assisted death. It could well be considerably less depending on uptake. In any event, updated costings would be presented alongside a draft law should the Assembly decide to accept this proposition. Sir, as far as my own views on the subject are concerned, I have little to add. Just like overdue voting rights for women in times gone by, and the overdue acceptance of homosexuality in my own lifetime, I consider this to be yet another of those seemingly complicated issues that have to be dealt with if we are to continue to develop as a caring and compassionate society. I know that some members of the Assembly will not agree with some or perhaps any of the proposals before us, but I'm confident that despite the emotions that might surface during this debate, we will navigate these tricky waters collectively with empathy, compassion, consideration and respect. Sir, I move the proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Is the proposition seconded? Does any member speak on the proposition? Deputy Ayer, then Deputy Ferry, then a comment.